I'm sure you've heard the phrase, sex work is the oldest profession in the world. But has anybody ever told you that it's also the most dangerous?
Dealing with the police, dealing with assaults by the police. Everybody has horror stories and stuff, and it's all just bad policy.
Decriminalization basically means that sex work would not be a crime anymore. So sex workers or their clients would not be criminally punished. Legalization means the government controls the profession and permits it only under specific conditions.
Half the world, including Russia, South Africa, and most of the US, regulates sex work by criminalizing everyone involved. So that's seller, buyer, and third parties. Lawmakers in these countries apparently hope that the fear of getting arrested will deter people from selling sex. But if you're forced to choose between obeying the law and feeding yourself or your family, you're going to do the work anyway and take the risk. Prohibiting the sex industry actually exacerbates every harm that sex workers are vulnerable to. The second approach to regulating sex work seen in these countries is partial criminalization, where the buying and selling of sex are legal, but surrounding activities like brothel keeping or soliciting on the street are banned. Laws like these, we have them in the UK and in France, essentially say to us sex workers, hey, we don't mind you selling sex, just make sure it's done behind closed doors and all alone. And brothel keeping, by the way, is just defined as just 2 or more sex workers working together. Making that illegal means that many of us work alone, which obviously makes us vulnerable to violent offenders. The idea behind this law is that selling sex is intrinsically harmful, and so you're in fact helping sex workers by removing the option. Despite growing support for what's often described as the end demand approach, there's no evidence that it works. There's just as much prostitution in Sweden as there was before.
The law was aimed at protecting sex workers, but has actually made life much harder for them. Sex workers have said that punishing their clients is akin to punishing them. Many sex workers and advocates have gone on record to say that sex workers now have to make riskier compromises to protect their clients from getting arrested. So they may have to go to clients' homes instead of having the clients come to them. They may have to compromise on using protection, on the amount of time spent with clients, on sexual acts performed, etc. All of this is infinitely more dangerous.
Something I'm often hearing is, prostitution would be fine if we made it legal and regulated it. We call that approach legalization, and it's used by countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and Nevada in the US. But it's not a great model for human rights. Under state-controlled prostitution, commercial sex can only happen in certain legally designated areas or venues, and sex workers are made to comply with special restrictions like registration and forced health checks. Regulation sounds great on paper, but politicians deliberately make regulation around the sex industry expensive and difficult to comply with. It creates a 2-tiered system, legal and illegal work. We sometimes call it backdoor criminalization. Rich, well-connected brothel owners can comply with the regulations, but more marginalized people find those hoops impossible to jump through. And even if it's possible in principle, getting a license or proper venue takes time and costs money. It's not going to be an option for someone who's desperate and needs money tonight. They might be a refugee or fleeing domestic abuse. Our demands are not complicated. You can ask expensive escorts in New York City, brothel workers in Cambodia, street workers in South Africa, and every girl on the roster at my old job in Soho, and they will all tell you the same thing. You can speak to millions of sex workers and countless sex worker-led organizations. We want full decriminalization and labor rights as workers.
Scrapping the laws making the purchase of sex a crime and enacting a new one that recognizes the existence of sex work and gives sex workers access to critical social services.
I think the basic bottom line is that criminalization is not working. Just like the criminalization of marijuana, people are going to still use marijuana, whether it's legal or not. And if it's illegal in a particular state or country, it forces them to go into the black market. The logic of decriminalization is to remove the bad actors as much as you can. It's designed to squeeze out the black market and eventually produce a green market. I support legalization as a second step after you decriminalize the law. Decriminalization simply means removing criminal penalties. So it's no longer a crime to buy or sell sex. But the next step would be some kind of legal regulation. And the question is, what are the best regulations that serve multiple interests, the community, the sex workers, and so on?
And I had a child when I was quite young. And as a teen parent and in my early 20s, I was a single mom, and it was really difficult financially to navigate like medical expenses and bills and rent and things like that with the jobs that were available to me, both due to my age and not having like educational experience or work experience. I didn't have, any college degrees or anything like that. So I was pretty much stuck doing entry level jobs, and it just didn't pay enough to sustain myself and my son. So I went into doing sex work.
You make a decision about what job you go into in the same way as a lot of other people do. You look at your options. I wanted to be a firefighter when I first started out, and I faced a lot of discrimination. I went into prostitution because it provided a higher wage than a lot of other women's wages, and it gave me a flexibility that I wasn't going to get. I don't promote prostitution. I would never go around saying it's a great job. It's a job like many other jobs. It's often the best choice out of a set of bad choices. But I think the thing is if you do want to reduce prostitution, then do something about the circumstances that force women, mainly mothers, into prostitution. One thing we know is that 80% of sex workers are women. Many of those are mothers.
Actually talk to sex workers and allowing them to express what their life experiences are, what they need, what would help them, but strictly from a sex worker perspective. And we just don't see a lot of that in the media. And getting involved in these policy conversations, we found that certainly the outreach is not a bad thing, but also it seemed logical to sort of move toward policy, because at this point, if you can help prevent bad policy, that's just already harm reduction in and of itself. You don't have to scramble later trying to mitigate the effects of bad policy. So we're really trying to push to be represented in those spaces as well.